Perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And so happy it is another one of our All Things Ireland edition. And who better to talk about Irish current affairs as well as Irish history than Eugene McCarten of the Eugene McCarten of the Communist Party of Ireland. Sorry about that. The Communist Party of Ireland. But Eugene, now, if I'm not mistaken, are you retired from being the general secretary of the Communist Party of Ireland, or what's happening?
I stood down. I used to run the bookshop and office and stuff, so I stood down because the party's undergone a lot of growth, and also there's never a good time and there's never a bad time. It's just you have to make up your mind when it's time to go. So I decided that there was sufficient younger comrades around the place, but also from health grounds and stuff like that, I decided that I needed a bit more, take care of myself a little bit better, and not put myself under that amount of stress. So I decided after the Congress, our 26th Congress, I decided that I would stand back from the position of General Secretary, but I'm still a member of the National Executive Committee, which would be the equivalent of a central committee. So I'm still a member of that. I'm still responsible for Socialist Voice, our monthly magazine, and I'm also active in my local branch. So I haven't walked, how do you say?
Not completely retired. Not completely retired.
No, that's not. You don't know. As I say, all companies don't retire. They just take on a different role.
Well, fantastic. And one of these days, we need to organize me coming to visit you and the comrades in Ireland, because that would be so epic. And just before I get to the questions, I also just want to say, please tell any member of the Communist Party of Ireland if they ever want to come on the program to talk about anything and everything, in open invitation, including their kindred spirits, their comrades in Northern Ireland. So
yep, no problem at all. Will do.
Yeah, so open invitation to them. But let's get started on this all things Ireland edition. Now, before we talk about an issue very dear to any leftist's heart, especially especially those who want a chance in life, which is the issue of education. Because it was St. Patrick's Day recently, do explain to people what's the real story behind St. What's the real story behind St. Patrick's? And when Ireland was colonized by Britain, Britain was a Catholic country colonizing another Catholic country, right? And just explain that complicated effect, because there's the issue of settler colonialism.
Go back into a very long period of history. All of them to say that the Ireland has suffered, or has experienced, both suffered and experienced the nearly 700 years of colonial occupation. So at the first stage, we would have been through the feudal times, when Ireland was both a clan-based system, and Britain was probably much more feudalistic, with the kings and queens, and that sort of whole feudalistic social relations of production had been the dominant one. And so at the time, a period of expansion of that period, at that time you would have had the Normans. Britain would have actually, or what we call then the kingdom of Britain, would have been right down as far as right down into France. So that was before all the nations of Europe became much more organized, much more, like you say, as we would know them today. St. Patrick was, there could be a number of St. Patrick's. Like all these things, it's the church constructed this person called Patrick, through as part of its evangelicization in Ireland. So when Patrick arrived in Ireland, Ireland would have been more of a pagan country, with the Celtic gods and Celtic feasts. So like all religions, they colonize the local culture and turn it into a useful vehicle for their own domination. So the Catholics, so it's believed that the St. Patrick that we talk about, or you see mentioned today, he will be the St. Patrick who was taken as a slave from Wales by Irish clans raiding across into Wales. He was taken as a slave and to become a sheep herder, and then he became a Christian, became a Catholic, and then he then set about apostolizing among the natives to bring Catholicism to them, and that is why he's seen as the patron saint. But in actual fact, he was someone who was like everything else. Those periods, it would have been whenever the clans would raid another area, across the water, they'd be raiding for animals and wealth, and also human beings. Take them back and make them work for you. So that was the common practice. So there's a number of people said written. There's a number of books, a number of St. Patrick's around at that time, but it's like all those things. It's lost in the mists of time. Exactly, if there was one Patrick or 10 Patricks, but that's the Patrick that we would celebrate on St. Patrick's Day. That only came mainly to the fore in many ways in the 19th century, with the emergence of Catholic after the repeal of the anti-Catholic laws, the dissenter laws, because the anti-Catholic laws, the penal laws, did not just impact upon Catholics, but also impacted upon dissenters, or what they call Presbyterians. So, but mainly in the main, it was driven to impact upon the Catholic community per se. So out of that, in the 18th century, 19th century, 1850, 1860s, 1870s, then this idea of St. Patrick's Day emerged, and is brought with them by the mass immigration of Irish to the United States, where it became this whole day of a day and pageant and marching. That mainly is a product of Irish America. Then it's been brought back to Ireland. So that's something which was created by the ancient order of Hibernians, or the fighting sons of St. Patrick, and all that. These are all the myths.
But when Britain colonized Ireland, and it was arguably the very first of what we call settler colonialism, that very brutal that very brutal system of capitalism and imperialism. Yep. But Britain was, for a period of time before Henry VIII, wanted to divorce his wife. So Britain was a Catholic. So was Britain a Catholic kingdom, which later colonized? Explain that for us, and the history of the person.
It was nothing to do really with the colony. It was religion was never really the factor. Was about land possessions, control over resources, and so it was always been that a factor. And so, at certain points of time, religion, probably whenever religion was more important in people's lives, religion was a factor. It was also using the settler colonialists who come into Ireland were mainly of the Protestant faith, mainly some large number of them would have come from Scotland, would have been a different variety of you got the England, the English Queen, King. English feudalism would have been centered around the Anglican Church, whereas in Scotland and other, it would have been part of the more reformed churches of the Calvinists and the Kirks and John Knox and that sort of very, very strict adherence to the Bible. So you've got all those factors coming into play. But the colonialism, at one stage, people will know about the Battle of the Boyne, and that's where it's supposed to be the defeat of Catholic Ireland. but in actual fact, King William was from Holland. Part of, was part of the whole alignment of forces across Europe. He became the King of England, the King of Britain, and but he then basically fought King James from Scotland. He fought him. They fought a battle out, not for Ireland but for the throne of England. So they fought a battle in 1690 in Ireland, and King William was of the Protestant tradition. King James was of the Catholic tradition. King William, or as you know in here, King Billy, he actually fought under the papal flag. So his army fought under the papal flag, the Pope of Rome, and James, he was fighting for what he saw was his place on the English throne. So Ireland just purely became the battleground for contending forces inside Britain itself. But it left the lasting legacy. It was to a degree, it is where unionism, Orangism, settler colonialism would see would be the first expression of their links to and relationship to Britain per se, or to England per se. So it's important in that sense. But the question of King Billy or being fighting under the banner of the banner of the Pope of Rome is lost. It's lost in that, because it doesn't suit the narrative, it doesn't suit the history, it doesn't suit the myths. But that's what it was. It was a battle between two contending forces for the throne of England, and it happened to be that King William won that battle, and King James then fled Ireland to go to France. So that was basically was the question of 1690. That was all about the question of, at that historical moment in time, the main contending force to British expansionism, English expansionism, was France. And so therefore France was always perceived to be the traditional enemy, of at that period for a couple of hundred years. France was the traditional enemy of the English and the English colonialism and English expansionism. So basically, it was caught up in a mixture of. So Ireland's always been caught up in this situation of power play between interests of British colonialism and the Irish people, and then the interest between contending colonial powers across Europe. We'll be caught the meat in the sandwich, and so it's always been the way, and it hasn't changed anything. Even in this current debacle around the protocol, it's the same process, that the interest of Ireland and the Irish people is very much secondary, thirdly, fourthly in down the pecking order of the interest. So the Northern Ireland Protocols is a dispute between British finance capital and the European Union, and what exactly will be the relationship between both after with the completion of Brexit. So it's got nothing to do with Britain's border in Ireland. It's more to do with what is Britain's relationship to be with the European Union. And I think that's where Sunkak has come across now. Clearly, they've had the ruling class of Britain, the finance capital, the City of London, have had enough of the internecine warfare inside the British Conservative Party, which is their party, and also the damage that is Britain's reputation. And so I've decided that Sunak's the man to deliver this, to finalise this Brexit and to get it off the table, and them to get on with a working relationship with the European Union. And that's what it is. So that's why it is. You can see now the internecine warfare inside the English Tory, English Conservative Party is dampened down an awful lot. The press are quite happy behind Sunak, because he is, as far as they're concerned, he is the person to get Brexit done. That Boris Johnson was causing them more problems than enough, so he had to be shopped. He had to be rid of. So Sunak, as far as they're concerned, is a safe pair of hands. He will get Brexit done, which will minimise the disruption between the City of London, the finance capital, and the European Union. So so they've settled it. So now that's why now you find in Brussels, it's all calm about It's all calm about Britain, Brexit and stuff like that. They're all calm about it. They're going through the motions, they're negotiating, and there's no big. On a year ago, they were in screaming all media across Europe. Now they're all very calm and very quiet. Sunak is demanded to get Brexit done in the interests of the City of London of finance capital.
And before we talk about the topic of education, and if we have time, I might even ask you a question about Northern Ireland, but going back to Ireland's tradition of Catholicism, when Henry VIII wanted to divorce his Spanish wife who couldn't bear him children, and then wanted his marriage annulled, and the church said no to it, and then later he got annulled and then just founded the Church of England, an Anglican Protestant Church of England. Was that when, even though Ireland was always a settler colonial country, heavily discriminated by the English feudal system, but did anti-Irish / Catholic laws and attitudes get more intense after Henry VIII founded the Church of England?
Yes, because it had to. It's like everything else that Henry VIII became the head of the Anglican Church. Same with the Queen of England, or the King of England today is the head of the Anglican Church. So therefore, these feudal power structures are hundreds and hundreds of years old. It doesn't mean that they don't have any power. They have power. They have influence. They're not the deciding factor, but they have power and influence. And the same thing in Ireland. They had to, because Ireland was perceived at the time to be a Catholic, therefore somewhat dangerous, and also because the Catholic majority were constantly pushing for to end colonial rule. That meant then basically they constantly forever were looking for allies abroad, and where they found allies abroad were in France and Spain. In other words, two countries which are in contention with British colonialism and the British Empire across the world. And so therefore they would see then, in order to defeat the Irish struggle for national independence, they had to weaken the material. We had to use whatever means necessary, and that was basically using repressive means against Catholicism, the Catholics, and to secure that, because as far as they were concerned, the Catholics were always looking to Britain's enemies for support. And that was basically up until the 1798 rebellion, when Wolfe Tone, a Presbyterian, and the United Irishmen, they looked to the United States and to France, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. They saw that as points of inspiration. People like Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, they sold nearly 100,000 copies in Ireland, which is a very big, large sale for a very country which is mostly illiterate. But it shows you the extent of the influence of Thomas Paine and the Rights of Man and the American Revolution, and then the French Revolution. So there was always that difficulty that the English and the imperialism and colonialism find very, very difficult. Because Ireland was constantly looking to Britain's enemies for support, and that then led them to constant repression. What they saw was the subversive nature of Catholicism, and then therefore they had to suppress it.
And also,
but that led to then also to a huge cultural identification with all things Catholic, and to a degree that was both a positive and a negative thing, and that's to a degree that was what the reactionary elements of the church used to consolidate its base after the defeat of in 1922, the establishment of the Free State in 1923. That sort of the whole consolidation of a reactionary form of Catholicism, and the control that asserted on people's, both women and working class, and the whole sort of conservative morality, the whole conservative politics, the whole conservative base of society was the foundations of Catholic social teaching. So that is really basically whenever the British founded Maynooth, it was Maynooth College, which was the main training college for priests in Ireland. The British founded that in order was to prevent the Irish priests going to France or to Spain or to Italy for education. So when they established Maynooth, that meant then basically, like all things in society, the ruling classes don't allow education institutions to develop outside of their influence. So Maynooth emerged and developed, and then basically it created a church which was deeply conservative, and also very much because they relied upon patronage from the British. Therefore, they became, in some aspects, a loyal ally of Britain inside Ireland, and that has remained. The Catholicism has always been a very the established church was certainly to a degree was largely reactionary at times. Very few of them of the bishops in Cardinal supported the 1916 rising. Very few of them supported the War of Independence, but they all supported the establishment of the Free State. In other words, cementing the half semi-detached independence from Britain. That was enough for them. So they all supported that process, but they didn't support the full struggle from in 1916. They didn't support the War of Independence or anything like that. They were always played their cards very, very careful. That's like a lot of religious people. They play their cards very careful. They say, they wait to see who wins.
That's so fascinating. That reminds me so much of the late Glenn Ford of Black Agenda Reports. There's this wonderful story that Glenn shared on the Real News Network and others when people ask about his biography, and he talked about how the first radio job he got working for James Brown's local Georgia radio, and he was told, these are the list of people that you to contact whenever the news breaks out. And then Glenn said that that it was Bishop this, Father that, and he said that he just took the paper, ripped it up, and threw it in the trash. And then when Paul J asks, why'd you have that attitude? And then Glenn Ford explains that, that it's actually a huge myth that the Black churches were instrumental in pushing the civil rights movement. He said that so many of those Black churches, Glenn says that he was just sick and tired of all of these what he called accommodationist priests who, when Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to do a march, wanted to do demonstrations, wanted to kick off the People Power movement, they would often refuse him, saying, "You're making too much. You're making too much trouble for us." And that's kind of how I feel when you talk about the Irish Catholic.
Same thing happened in the north of Ireland with the civil rights movement. As far as they were concerned, partition of Ireland benefit two things. It allowed the Catholic Church to have complete control over the health services, the education system. And as the old Jesuit saying is, give me a child to 7 and you'll have him for life. And the way the Catholic Church viewed that was basically, if we control the education system, the health services, all types of social provision, we control that, then we will control the population. And in the north of Ireland, where there was wholesale discrimination against Catholics, the Catholic Church didn't really do much about it, because they're basically where people were driven into.
Catholic Church did not do much about
No. So basically, what they then, it allowed them to achieve a hegemony over the Catholics in the 6 counties in the north of Ireland. They had a hegemony over them because basically it was the people, so to identify with their Irishness, they had to identify through the church and through the GAA. And so that was the only ways to express themselves. So it meant then that it'll give then the church a big hegemonic grip over the people in the north. And I remember going in the civil rights demonstration, the civil rights demonstrators went to Bishop Philbin. He was the chief battle washer of the Catholic Church in the north of Ireland in 1968-69. And they went to ask him to support the civil rights demonstration. He said he wouldn't support the civil rights. He wouldn't support them. So they were, because basically they saw it also to a challenge to their authority, their control over the community. So as I said, they used partition for their own ends, both to consolidate their control and influence in the north, but also their control and influence in the south. And the consequences are the same. This very, at one time I read a was a conversation with a person and who believed in the liberation theology, and
Yeah.
but he described it as that the Catholic Church in Ireland from the 1850s onwards basically became a reflection of Victorian moral and social values. So all their criticism, their restrictions are based upon Irish culture, dancing, music, gatherings, social gatherings, and all that were very much reflective of what the Victorians imposed in Britain. That's strict regimentation, and so what the Catholic Church basically they took on board all the social and cultural values, moral values of Victorian Britain, and imposed them on the people of Ireland right up until like 1960s, 70s, when they made basically when the social change began, the social base of society began to change, and much more confrontation, much more challenges to the Catholic Church took place. But up until that was guided by that was they were guided by Victorian moral values. So it's an impact, it's an indication of the impact of the establishment of Maynooth and the construction of a how do you say ideological foot soldiers within the community, which reflected the needs and interests of British colonialism, British imperialism, and that's where it out. And that basically that whole so you couldn't have they basically embraced in order for them to maintain their power, they had accommodation with British imperialism. They absorbed an awful lot of the power, the how would you say the cultural norms of the establishment, and then imposed upon everybody else.
So so that's that's actually we'll talk about education later, but because I like where we're going with this. Actually, I think that's a perfect segue to actually talk about, because you already mentioned Northern Ireland, you already talked about the disputes with the EU. So before we talk about education and the Mary Magdalene Aslims, I briefly, if it's even possible, what is your assessment of Sinn Fein historically, the provincial IRA in Northern Ireland? Because you talked about how because your party is one of the rare left movements in the Republic of Ireland, and I would even think, and in Northern Ireland, which actually wants a Lexit, actually wants to leave the European Union because you feel it's a rapacious neoliberal institution and that it's a boss's club between all of the Euro capitalists and once upon a time the Anglo capitalists. Now, Sinn Fein once upon a time was also against Ireland. Well, they were against Northern Ireland. They were against Northern Ireland joining the European Union. But later, they've completely flipped that because during the referendum, Sinn Fein basically became EU Left Reformists in much the same way the SNP is, the kind of Yanis Varoufakis of the world, and want to remain in the European Union and try to reform it as an EU Left, for an EU Left project. And I know Fra Hughes, who a lot of his articles are published in Orinoco Tribune, and he's a very big advocate of Palestinian solidarity. And I've read a lot of his articles where he is very critical of Sinn Fein and thinks that Sinn Fein sold out, reunification with the Republic of Ireland, and also sold out its leftism to the European Union and whatnot. So what's your assessment actually of Sinn Fein and all the stuff that I mentioned?
Well, I think it's like all of this month will be marked as the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Belfast Agreement, or what is more commonly known as the Good Friday Agreement. When asked, like in all processes, you always have to try to evaluate who stood to gain, who lost. Were the processes advancing your strategic goals, or were they ended up basically retarding and restricting your goals? And I think that's whether things sold out or not. That's I think that's all down to ideology. What was the ideology or the belief, understanding of Sinn Féin? What was it? Its identification with and as the political organisation of the IRA, and armed resistance by the IRA, was perceived by many to be personification of radicalism. So you have to say, well, you'd have to strip that back, and simply because someone has a gun or a bomb doesn't necessarily make them radical. It is the ideas as to why you have a gun or why you have a bomb and why you do what actions you are, why your action, what actions, what ideas shape your actions when you have those implements. And I think that is a critical question. The other thing is that Sinn Féin, of course, because it was come out of a very much a popular uprising by the Catholic community way back in 69, 70, 71, whenever the communities were under huge pressure from the armed forces of the Orange State of settler colonialism. The IRA developed and emerged in a popular base among these communities. And like all things that once you move on to once you develop, struggle creates new opportunities, and you then begin to look at what are we about? What makes us different from the other Sinn Féin? Because there's two Sinn Féins, there's official Sinn Féin and the provisional Sinn Féin. You begin to think, what makes you distinguish yourself from others? So like a political party, if you split from another party, you tend to emphasize what is different, why we're different, and from those people over there. And I think to a degree, over that period in the 1970s, you had a resurgence of national liberation movements across Africa. The ANC, you had SWAPO, you had MPLA, you had all types of revolutionary organizations. You had revolutionary groupings and revolutions in Nicaragua. You had in
Hezbollah as well. Hezbollah as a response to Israeli.
So you had so therefore the ideas of radical ideas were much more widespread, much more shaping our force in society in Africa, wherever Latin America. Ideas of Marx and Engels were much more forceful ideas in Latin America and Africa. Not so Sinn Féin was influenced by these, so they embraced some of these ideas. What the cement that held the Sinn Féin together and the Republican movement together was support for the IRA. So when the IRA unilaterally declared a ceasefire, that then began to see that cement. And what was if underlying was purely the form of struggle, the method of struggle, rather than the ideology. So then basically once you've stopped one form of struggle, then there was deep confusion as to how the political struggle should develop. And when you've got a very underdeveloped ideology, then that's whenever things become even more fragmented. And I think that so the question of Republican movement, Sinn Féin, the cornerstones of republicanism is sovereignty. The people are sovereign, therefore the nation should be sovereign. Independence, therefore in order for independence, the nation must be sovereign, but independent, that people allow, so that people can determine what the future should be. And democracy is about the people deciding. So they are all key tenets of Republican ideology, including liberty, equality. It's always in liberty, equality, fraternity. So you had liberty, equality, and that fraternity was international solidarity. So those were all key tenets. So gradually over the process of the Good Friday Agreement, the political settlement, and politically the balance of forces that existed in Ireland at that period 25 years ago, the balance of forces were not on the side of Irish democracy. So because of the lack of underdeveloped ideology, Sinn Féin made its alliance then with Irish America, with US imperialism. It made its alliance with the Southern establishment in the hope that they would be, what they would see it was coming in on the side of Irish nationalism and basically driving a deal which would force the British out. Irish America is like all things. It's like the curate's egg. It's good in spots and bloody awful all over the place. So most of it is pretty. So we have a situation that Irish American politicians are well in tune, with the need with US imperialism globally and internationally. So the Good Friday Agreement was, to a degree, it was an agreement cobbled in many ways to suit the needs and interests of US imperialism, the European Union, and Britain.
Uh, interesting.
So,
Interesting.
that was so. So then they set up these institutions, and like everything else, when you've got an underdeveloped ideology, or you're not exactly too sure what you're fighting for, you were fighting an armed struggle to get the British out. The armed struggle is gone. You're left now with a political strategy, and you're saying, well, what are exactly our political goals? So that they may not have had a full development of those goals. So therefore, saying that they're sold out would require them to have had a rounded world view, a social transformative world view. They never had. So therefore, to say they sold out is it's an easy one. It's an easy answer to a complex question. So Sinn Féin then has been caught up in the last 25 years in institutions which are geared towards defending the status quo. And like everything else, and so if you're marking political progress by the amount of votes you secure, by the amount of MPs or TDs that you get elected, then you're very much working within the parameters of the structures of laid out by imperialism. And so if that's the case, then elections become not a means to advance and develop ideological level or ideological struggle within the people. It becomes who can best manage the process that is here. So how best to manage capitalism, not about how do we it's not about saying capitalism is fundamentally anti-democratic, it's fundamentally anti-human, and it's fundamentally anti-environment. If you don't approach it in that way, then you're basically then, well, we can manage this thing better than they can. We can do this and they will do that. And so so basically then you become corralled into those structures. You can corral into those structures. And then so they become self-fulfilling. Then your only objective is to stay within those structures and to maintain those structures and to grow within those structures. So that leaves you then, your political struggle is determined by institutions and forces that you one time opposed, but now you've become so caught up in them, corralled in them, that you're not able to actually, see the wood for the trees. You're not able to see beyond those institutions. And I think that's where it is. So I think basically the Republicans have abandoned, I think, key corners of Republican ideas. That is the question of sovereignty, which would draw you the question about the European Union. So they have abandoned the question of the critical approach they had years ago in regards that the European Union and the laws and treaties of the European were an infringement upon Irish sovereignty and Irish democracy. They've abandoned that now. They've made their accommodation with the European Union. So they're saying that we are critical of the European Union. Everybody's critical of the European Union. That doesn't distinguish anything. So they've abandoned the whole concept or struggle for sovereignty, the whole struggle for independence, and the whole question of democracy. And so therefore they're allowing that institutions like the European Union should have the final say over what Irish people can or cannot do. And I think that the latest agreement between the European Union and Britain in the form of the Winchester, or the, what do you call it, not Winchester, the Windsor Agreement.
Yeah.
The Windsor Agreement was negotiated between the European Union and Britain. But they said it was about solving a problem in Ireland. So the people who had the problem were not consulted or asked. But so basically, I think that exposes the myth that it was about anything to do with Ireland. But the Windsor Agreement is about finalising the relationship between Britain and the European Union. Ireland happened to be a chest on the board, the chessboard of global or European politics, and that has been the case in a settler, in a colonialist environment. The colonized people are always going to be chess pieces, little pawns on the chessboard of moving them around while they decide what the big questions are and what the big relationships are. So,
And I
so
also
when,
and also just want to say, open invite to anyone from the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland, and if you are a supporter of Sinn Féin or a member, an open invite for us on 1+1 to actually have a debate on EU left reformism or Lexit, a left exit. And I think that would be a very interesting debate discussion to have with Eugene. So
so most people,
I have to ask this question then, which is what's your assessment of, because wasn't there big local elections 2 years ago in Northern Ireland in which Sinn Féin basically wiped off the pro Ulster, the pro Unionist parties in England? Didn't Sinn Féin basically like wipe them off the map, made huge gains? And talk about that. What's your what's your assessment of that?
basically, there are, of course, demographics are changing. The Catholic nationalist Republican communities is now moving towards parity in numbers with unionism. With so that has a consequences. There are deep challenges for Britain. Britain has always, firstly since partition, relied solely upon unionism as its guarantor of its influence and control. It recognises that that position is an awful lot weaker, and therefore what Britain has done is reconfigured its allies. So Britain has reconfigured its allies in Ireland. Its chief ally in Ireland now is the Irish government, and that's who its chief ally is. Unionism
When you say Britain's chief ally when it comes to Northern Ireland is the Irish government, you mean from the Republic of Ireland, where you're based?
Yes, yeah,
okay, yeah.
So that's so Britain is attempting to reconfigure its relationship with forces in Ireland, because it is good. Because they think in decades, they don't think in days. So the strategic view of imperialism has always been look as to what the next number of decades will be and where they want to be and what they want to achieve. And I think that's so Britain has a strategic view of realigning of the forces in Ireland. So the Irish government is now effectively, because it is a junior partner to the European Union, as a junior partner to the US, and is now a junior partner with the with Britain itself, and they're using the Irish government as a means to placate, to limit the the aspirations of republicanism of the nationalist community in the north, and so we end up basically what has ended up is that at local authority level, at the institutions of Stormont, you've had a discussion about the carving up of the resources are controlled by the British. The budget is controlled by the British. And so what you end up basically is the local politicians, the local political institutions then carving up that budget. And because of the nature of the political settlement of the Good Friday Agreement, that has now become highly sectarianized. So it has so that eventually the Good Friday Agreement hasn't weakened Britain's rule. It has just basically redefined the relationships and has intensified the Good Friday has intensified sectarianism, because it's all done on the basis of if you get a house, we have to get a house. So basically, it has entrenched sectarianism in a deeper way, and the only people who benefit from sectarianism and division like that is the British. So all these things are all coming together. The Irish government, as it saw, is that both the Irish government and the British government, what they really wanted, two things they wanted at this whole process. One was they wanted the IRA to end its campaign. So in other words, they wanted to decommission IRA arms. So that was one key corner of it. And the second key corner of it was the decommissioning of radical Republican politics. So you have to ask the question. The IRA has decommissioned. Therefore, the IRA is no longer a military threat or a military response to the political crisis in the north. And what they have then succeeded in doing is basically they have de-radicalized. They've taken out any concepts of anti-imperialism, critiques of imperialism, which you would have found in Sinn Féin's approach towards the European Union, towards supporting solidarity movements in Latin America, and various other things like that. So basically, they have managed to decommission radical Republican politics as well as decommission weapons. And that's the most critical point for us. Our point of view is the most critical thing is not about the decommission of weapons; it is about the decommissioning of radical Republican politics.
What was the response? Now, I'm curious because you're going to give us a window into the Irish corporate state media, and what was the response of the Irish corporate state media to this big victory of Sinn Fein in Northern Ireland? Because yeah, what was the response? I'm curious.
Oh, they were all worried and concerned, and as they are, like Sinn Féin is growing in the south. It's not because it's presenting a radical political program. It is basically is a combination of the deep anger among people at the whole with their lot, with the poor health services, with the overcrowded education system, with extortionist rents, and no ability to actually to get a home.
No, it was a protest vote. A positive. So I mean, because when people talk about protest votes, it's usually in a very reactionary form of a far right vote. But this is a protest vote in which, I mean, if I was a dissatisfied Irish person in Northern Ireland and in the Republic, I would be voting for Sinn Fein as a protest vote, yeah. or even your party, the Communist Party of Ireland.
So that's the way they view it. So that's why. So that is where. So people are voting for that. So like everything else, so Sinn Fein is because you're geared towards electoralism. Therefore, your primary political strategy is not to lose votes. Your strategy is to gain votes. So therefore, you're never going to say things which are proposed policies which were to a degree would allow you to be pilloried by the establishment, to be attacked by the establishment. So you don't talk about a wealth tax, you don't talk about transformation, the transfer of wealth, any of those things. So you operate and you argue within very much the framework of the establishment. And the same goes in the North. The North do believe, the unionism believes that the Protestant people have nowhere else to go but to vote unionist. And Sinn Féin has a belief that nationalists, Catholic communities, have nowhere else to go but to vote Sinn Féin. And that's always a recipe for disaster, because that's a recipe for arrogance, it's a recipe for complacency, and it's also a recipe for doing nothing, because how to say, socialism is the future and you build it today. If you want to transform society, then you have to put forward policies which are about transforming power and social and economic and power relationships and power structures. So if you're not advocating a radical transformation, what you end up basically is accepting the status quo, and that is to a degree what is now is, but accepting the status quo.
But then going back to what you were saying, I think that's a perfect segue to talk about the education system in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, and the Mary Magdalene Aslam, the patriarchy of Ireland. So
the Magdalene laundries were, well,
but before we get into that, let's talk about about the education system now, because in Ireland, you said that the two main parties after Ireland became a republic after the partition, so that's Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and these are both right-wing parties. These are both and maybe one is a little bit more of a compassionate conservative, maybe the other one is a little less, because that's where most of the healthcare, the education was all in the hands of basically the Catholic Church, correct? And these were the parties that Britain would have these are the parties that Britain was very happy came into power after independence, because these were capitalists and they didn't really believe in the sort of radical left nationalism or revolutionary transformative society which the Communist Party of Ireland, the James Connollys of the world would have advocated, right?
So you have Fine Gael is the most was and is the most pro-imperialist, because it was a party that supported the partition of Ireland, supported the settlement imposed by the British.
And their leader, and their leader was Eamon de Valera, right?
No, Fine Gael it would have been Cosgraves and various other elements of it from Arthur Griffith. There would have been Fianna Fáil, that would have been, they would mainly been the Irish capitalist class, would have been centred around Fine Gael, would have been centred around the big farmers and those kind of actions connected to Britain itself, who had an economic interest in maintaining links with Britain, who had an economic interest in not fully pursuing independence. They were quite happy to remain within the empire with the dominion status, or whereby they could have access to continue with access to the British markets, continue access to British capital, and to continue have marginal benefits from the British Empire. Fianna Fáil reflected those elements within Irish republicanism, the national movement, who wanted to pursue pursue a position to push forward for national independence, but they would have been the small farmers, the urban workers and stuff like that. But like everything else, once they it's like very similar to Sinn Féin. Once they got into the institutions of the government in the republic, they began then to basically to work with those institutions, to work within that framework, and over a period of time, the institutions shaped Fianna Fáil. Though Fianna Fáil didn't shape the institutions, those institutions shaped Fianna Fáil, and that's to a degree is a reflection of Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin is not shaping those institutions. Those current institutions are shaping Sinn Féin and its political direction. So Fianna Fáil
is that why when we when we watch documentaries about Northern Ireland, we hear a lot from Northern Irish voices, from British voices, but not so much from the Republic of Ireland themselves. Because for the Republic of Ireland themselves, is that just like, hey, we wouldn't mind in the future Northern Ireland being married back to us, but you know what? We're done with the situation. Northern Ireland, that's a UK problem.
It's to be, as they all said, the bigger the choir you hear from those forces who are opposed to radical change, they'll say we have to be realistic. We have to be realistic, and so by the Southern establishment, we have to be realistic. A united Ireland is a nice idea, but not just yet. But not just yet never comes. There's never the ideal moment for a united Ireland from their perspective. So what allowed them, whenever the establishment of the Free State, or what we call the Free State now, the Republic of Ireland, that was the key element. The Catholic Church was the education was handed over to the Catholic Church. To a degree, they created ideological underpinning of the partitionist settlement. And so therefore the Catholic Church was given control over education. They were equally given control over the provision of healthcare, hospitals. So the hospitals, a lot of hospitals were owned and run by religious orders. So if you wanted to get treatment in a hospital, you had to go to a Catholic hospital. If you wanted to go to education, the only people who provided education were the Catholic Church. And so therefore you had to go into the Catholic educational system, the Catholic ethos. So over 40 years,
because these Catholics, because as you mentioned, you say that it's a myth that the Catholic Church of Ireland was the leading force of progressivism. That no, they were very reactionary, and do you think, does that explain why education in Ireland is not a right, and very much like in England, it costs a fortune. It literally costs an arm and a leg. It's why most of the education is private, and even the public ones are overpriced. And because of that system, and because it's often in the hands of a very reactionary Catholic Church, not the kind of progressive, Catholic Church like liberation theology, does that explain, the patriarchal system which leads us to the institutions of the Mary Magdalene, as
it is all of those things. I think that when you handed over like for instance, the Catholic Church was strongly opposed to public housing with the foundation of this state, the partition. The Catholic Church was opposed to public housing because they thought that was akin to Bolshevism. That a property owning class, a property owning society means people had a stake in the system, therefore create more stability for the system. And you think about that, that's what is a mortgage? If you're buying a house and you have a mortgage, what is it? It's a choke chain. If you want to train an animal to not to hurt them, but to behave and not to run across roads, you train them not to do that. So a mortgage is a choke chain. So you're limited to your first priority. If you want to buy a mortgage, you have to pay your mortgage every month. That's the first priority. That's the first call on your wages. When your wages or salary, the first call is to pay the mortgage. If you don't pay the mortgage, you're out. So people say, I own my own house. And you say, well, have you paid it all off? No, we've only got 10 years to go. Then you don't own your own house. The bank owns that house. You only own that bank on the last payment when the last payment is made. So therefore, it's a good way of disciplining people, because basically you can't go on strike. If you can't, it's difficult to go on strike. I've got a mortgage to pay. You can't go down to the banks and say, well, I'm on strike. It could be 6-8 weeks before I'm back, and I'll come back and sort out my mortgage. Then the banks will say no. But if you're in a public house, in public housing, you were on strike, you could go down to the local authority and say, I'm on strike, I've no money, I'll come back and pay my arrears when I'm back off strike.
And meanwhile, does the Catholic Church in Ireland, do they get all of these sweet deals when it comes to not paying much taxes because it's all considered a private charity?
No, so you have all that. So basically, so the church was underpinning bourgeois ideology and bourgeois economic theory, and that is always the case. Like at one stage in Dublin, housing plans for big corporation states had to be sent to the Archbishop of Dublin for him to okay it. So when you see big working class housing estates in Dublin, you find the center of them. At the center of all these working class estates are the churches. The churches. So they have always, so in other words, housing, whatever it was constructed around their infrastructure, the church's infrastructure, and it's therefore flowed around its ideological influence and its cultural influence. So it was always going to be a conservative force. Therefore, it was a view of the establishment. Therefore, it was a great method to and calculate bourgeois ideology to establish and calculate stability into the system. Because if you couldn't get a job anywhere, if you're a teacher and you spoke out, you couldn't get a job. You'd be sacked. If you're a teacher which weren't married and had a child outside of wedlock, you could get sacked. People could be affected by that. Same with the health services. So if the church controlled all these important institutions, it also means it controlled livelihoods. So your work was dependent upon your moral adherence to their moral values. So if you weren't adhering to their moral values, then your job was on the line, was in difficulty. And so what you had two institutions in Ireland which had a huge impact upon working people. One was the industrial schools. The industrial schools were where mainly children from the working class communities were lifted off the streets and put into institutions of care of the state, which were mainly run by religious orders, and that's where a huge amount of sexual abuse took place in these industrial schools, which were basically children, the sons and daughters of from working class communities. And literally, you had in places like Dublin, they called the poor man. He would come around lifting any child was saw on the street without being parental supervision, was lifted and put in an industrial school. And there's huge crimes took place against children and teenagers in these industrial schools. They tend to be in very isolated areas. Thousands and thousands of children.
But Eugene, that sounds so shocking, because that sounds to me like the child labor and the systemic abuse of the stories we hear of Charles Dickens, the poor laws.
Absolutely, this one right on up to the 60s. So these were institutions run by the state. So therefore, they were also a way of disciplining people, because people knew that these institutions existed. It was a way of instilling fear, of instilling control. And then coupled with that, then you had this misogynistic view of the church regarding to women, and women born out of wedlock, women having children out of wedlock. So then they established these other institutions called the Magdalen Laundries. But that was also women of the poor. It was poor women. Because when you had money, I come from a family with, in the main, had access to money or opportunity. You could always find solutions. You can always find solutions of going off to England for whatever else and find a solution there. But the women of the poor couldn't. If you were a young woman who were maybe from a small farm in rural Ireland, you went and got a job in the local hardware shop or the local hotel, or with the big farmer as a housekeeper, and therefore you begin then become you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable to economic pressure, because if you didn't go along with what the farmer, if you didn't go along with what he wanted, if you didn't go along with the local hardware shop owner wanted, if you didn't go along with the local hotel owner wanted, or the local bar owner wanted, then you're out. And where else were you to go? Because you were looking your family back on the farm, maybe 10 kids back on the farm, your siblings back on the farm. You knew your job was going to contribute to that survival of that family. And so therefore they used those economic pressures to do what they did do, and that was then basically a lot of poor women from poor backgrounds, women who work in very vulnerable working conditions, precarious employment like the service industry and all those. So they were one of the most vulnerable and the most open to super exploitation, not just from poor wages, but also from sexual exploitation. And then the Catholic Church then basically opened up these institutions to, to pretend that this stuff wasn't happening in Catholic Ireland. It wasn't the local businessman who was a pillar of society, the pillar of the community. He wasn't abusing his staff sexually in the hotel or in the hardware shop or on the farm, because they were not only the pillars of the community, they were also pillars of the church. And so therefore the church then used these institutions to, or they say, it was to mask the deep social abuse that was taking place in Ireland at the time. And so that has always been that. So therefore,
how complicit is the Irish government? How complicit was the first Prime Minister De Valera and the two right-wing parties?
They were all happy enough. They were all happy enough. I would like everything else. It's like, if you want to turn a blind eye, it doesn't. The now wringing of hands and lashing of teeth now. Oh, it's terrible! It's terrible! It's terrible. But all these institutions were were supervised by the state. They had inspectors going around these places. So you had a school inspector going around these industrial schools. They were inspecting what was going on, but they turned a blind eye. There were inspectors going around these laundries and various other places, but they turned a blind eye because it didn't suit them, because the Catholic Church ideological and cultural control was far more important than the abuse being suffered by working class kids and working class women in these institutions. So basically,
this is also a form of cheap slave labor, right?
Yeah, you had no right. Women had no rights, absolutely no rights, and their children were taken off them immediately. And then a large number of them ended up in the States. Wealthy Irish Americans, Catholic Irish Americans, got children from these laundries. There's a situation like in Britain after the Second World War in Derry. Thousands of children from Derry were taken from Derry and shipped to Australia. So this has always been the process that these people have engaged in. They've always treated working class people with absolute contempt. Absolute contempt. And so that's where we have to get back to this whole concept of democracy and representation. It is only there, is useful to them so long it maintains the status quo. Well, if it doesn't maintain the status quo, they will change the rules. So we have to, all these things that happen were about the consolidation of the power of the elite, the power of the ruling elements. Weak and all as they may have been in their relationship, what we would call the comprador bourgeoisie, the Irish capitalist class is comprador. It's dependent upon this relationship with imperialism, with either British imperialism, the European Union, or the United States. They have, without the patronage of those other forces, the Irish ruling class would be weak economically, politically, and culturally.
Before we talk, before we get to our last topic, which is education and why and why the right is so determined to make education not a right, I have to ask this question, which is what role did your party, the Communist Party of Ireland, play in bringing justice to those boys you were talking about in the industrial schools and the Mary Magdalene Aslims? Because communist parties, I think you're no stranger to communists not getting credit when credit is due.
Well, for way back in even back in the 1930s, in our paper, you can through the archives, our paper constantly carried articles about the abuse in the industrial schools was taking place, and the abuse of women in these Magdalene laundries and stuff like that. So we've had a long record of that. It was also because we were in ourselves were under a huge amount of pressure at during those periods. Our papers were banned. We had big trouble trying to get leaflets printed. We had the Catholic Church printed photographs of leading members on the front page of their newspapers. They put pickets on our houses. And
so in Ireland, you and the party also weren't safe from
Red Scare. Red Scare was McCarthyism and whatnot. There's quite a few things where the Catholic Church would print the names of comrades, they print their places of work, and they print their addresses, home addresses. So that would so inciting mobs to attack their homes or get them sacked from jobs. So it was always a very difficult. So we were aware of this. Our capacity to, how would you say, to influence those things was small, given the small nature of the organization. But it didn't stop us from highlighting them, to raising these questions and trying to do something about them. But I'd say that it was a very all-embracing, all-encompassing ideological control by the Catholic Church. That has now been, in some ways, defeated as ideologically conservatism. The conservatism of the Catholic Church was necessary at a particular historical moment in time. Now it is now the new Bible is now liberalism. Everybody has to be liberal. Everybody has to accept all this bullshit to go on with. So this is the new orthodoxy. So you're not allowed to speak outside of the parameters as what they have led them down today. So, well, one time conservatism suited them because basically it was about controlling and everything else. Now in liberalism, you need to, if you're going to bring migrant workers in and migrants from all over Europe, then you're going to have to allow them the same rights as they have where they come from. So you've got all this stuff now. So this new orthodoxy is now imposed upon people, and but none of it's people-centered. It's all about what they think is in the best socio-economic interest to maintain the system. It's not about whether it's human interest or anything like that. Far from it. So these are all new orthodoxies, and the education system is critical in any society. Is critical because that is where you reproduce the dominant ideology. It's through education that they reproduce the dominant ideology.
Because I wanted perfect segue. Perfect segue to talk about education, which will be the last thing we talk about. I am a Marxist. I am, I am far left. I am, socialist. But for me, okay, I can sort of understand the logic of libertarians, capitalists, whatever stripe, when they say that we can't have government regulations like we need to be free to make our business whatever way they want. And I can sort of understand the logic behind low taxes, corporate subsidies, and whatnot. I can sort of understand that logic. What I can never ever understand is, why is the right wing, why are liberals so determined to make education this overpriced commodity and not have education as a right, as say healthcare? Because I think even I think even if you met the average Irish right winger or British right winger or Australian right winger or anyone from across the continent of Europe, they'll all say things like, oh no, I do believe in the form of an NHS. Yes, healthcare is a right. The government should be taking care of that. But then when it comes to business and education, that's where that's where their most reactionary policies comes out. And why is the right so determined? Why are the capitalists so determined to make education?
I think to go back, sort of just go back to the point you made about libertarians opposed to state involvement and state regulation, state control. You have three aspects, all these questions about regulation and controls and standards. They're all a product of mass political struggle. In other words, the working class have fought for years. There was the working class who fought against children working in pits, mines and factories and stuff like that. I'm sure the capitalist class at that time would be libertarian because they said, well, it's my factory and I can employ whomever I like. But we have to accept, we set standards which are things which are not acceptable. We want regulation, we want control, but they're all come out of democratic struggles by working people. And the libertarians don't want to do it because business said, I have the capital and therefore I absolute right and privilege to decide how that capital is used or dispensed with. In other words, I don't care about the rest of you. So they don't basically, they want to do is remove any forms of controls over exploitation and how that exploitation takes place and where the benefits of that exploitation goes to. And so therefore they will say, it's my factory, I'm making these profits, therefore you have no say over control over what I do with those profits. Whereas we've been, for decades, the working class, been fighting for taxes on profits, taxes on capital. And the only people who oppose taxes on capital are the capitalists. Everybody else thinks it's a good idea. So the question of education, it's education, you can say in the 20th century, what we would call mass democratic education was a product of mass struggle. The right to be, it started out with the right to go to school up into primary school or first school. That was one. And then the next advance was to right for my kids to go to second level school. And then in the 60s, it became, with the scientific and technological revolution, they also needed, as objective needs as well, of capitalism. So in the 1960s, there was the emergence of the scientific and technological revolution. Therefore, they needed to expand the material base of those who could access third level education, because they needed greater numbers of scientists, greater numbers of technicians and engineers and things like that. So therefore, it was in their interest also to expand access to third level education. So you have to look at it today. Is the scientific and technological revolution? Where is that? Where is that now? China, it's India, it's bits and pieces around other parts of the world. Vietnam, it's in Indonesia and various other places. And so therefore, do they need universal third level education? Do they really need it? Do they need to home produce vast numbers of graduates? Because if you look at it, most of the people, not most, but there's a high percentage of our graduates are not working in the fields they graduated out of college from. They're working in crappy jobs, serving coffee or working in a factory, whatever else. They don't really need that number anymore. But like everything else, once it's there, you can't really undo it per se. So what they would love to have, I think, what they'd like to do is like to have purely functional literacy, that everybody can read and write and use the technology, use the smartphones and the iPads and the laptops and access all this technology. But that that's functional literacy. That's all they need. That's all they need. For education, it's not about education for education's sake, but enriching and developing new human beings. It's about basically can you make them much more their labor much more valuable? And at this moment in time, that's what education is about. How do we make these persons' labor more valuable to us? And if the situation has reached the point where maybe they don't need all these engineers, Maybe they don't need all these technicians and scientists because they've got enough of them. They can also get them cheaper somewhere else.
In
And it's right.
Ireland, but in Ireland, isn't the education system very much like Britain, in which you have to take a loan to go
No,
to
no, actually, well, no,
private
actually,
college?
well, well, they have actually. Well, it's a combination of things that a lot of young people join up, get into when they go to third level college. All schools, they will call first schools and second schools, what they call a voluntary donation, every fundraising and various other things. But in relatively speaking, it's free in the sense of you don't have to pay to get in the front door, but you'll have to pay your school fee. You have to pay for your uniform and buy your books. But so that's that. Third level is there's a standard. Some region of the class could be like 3,000 a year. Some students are entitled to grants, some students are not. But so they would say that that it's free, but not free in the sense of it's not like if you want to go to the big public schools in Britain, it'll cost you a lot more, or the Ivy League colleges, you basically end up with hundreds of thousands in debt in the United States. Whereas students do get into debt here because there's other aspects to education. Not alone is there access to education, but also your capacity to do that, to access it. So where do you find accommodation? How do you feed yourself? Where do you get the money to buy the books that are required? So all these are other factors that come into play when you talk about education. It's not just the fee you pay at the front door, but is the other ancillary problems like the question of paying for accommodation, feeding yourself, clothing yourself, buying books. And because basically most, like all things, most young people tend to travel to go to college. So you could be people from Limerick living in Dublin, or people from Donegal living in Dublin, or people in Donegal living in Limerick, going to college in Limerick, or going to college in Cork. So they've all additional expenses. So that rules out an awful lot of working families because they can't afford to pay the 3,000 or 4,000 per year fees, plus accommodation, plus feed and
But
clothing.
why wouldn't the capitalist class just say, okay, like healthcare, let's just make it all for free, and it's once they start job hunting and stuff like that, then that's when we can really make life hard for the working class because
well, the point is, well, I guess because of the whole nature of the capital accumulation and markets and capitalism expansion, capitalism finds it now that there's no area, it's all saying is no area of human life will not be left unexploited. So whether we want to feed ourselves, put shelter on our head, get a doctor, get educated, those are all areas for exploitation and to make money, to make capital for reinvestment and further capital. So you're not going to find anything outside of capital control where they cannot accumulate additional capital. So education is just another means to whereby it can be a way of how do you say, rationing out access, but also it's a case of making vast money. Because most of I'm sure it's the same in the States, but you've got now here in Ireland, some of the universities of old faculties are now sponsored by corporations. So you've got all these things. Go there. That means in the scientific area, you got young people who are very keen brains, very sharp, very energetic, and prepared to work a lot of hours, doing a lot of scientific research. The university will set up little companies so the little company to focus in on this particular aspect of research. And waiting in the rings. The wings is whenever it's reached the point where it's the state and the schools and stuff we can have actually put enough money into it has now become a feasible possible project. Then the corporations move in and buy it up immediately and take it away. So they see that as basically as the state is providing them with to a degree called seed capital, or the individual. They just see individuals, scientists as capital, seed capital, and they can be exploited and used at a particular point in time. So we've got all these things. I think there's nothing outside of the human experience that capitalism will not exploit. Human beings will be exploited at all levels, from children right up to old people, whether it be sort of private home care for private homes, for residential homes for the older. They will all make, anywhere they can make a profit will be used, will be privatized, will be used for the accumulation of wealth by a minority. So it's nothing new. It's part and parcel of the system itself. The system will not allow. Why would you allow, like a farmer leaving half the field, half the land empty? You say, you exploit every aspect of the land in order to get it maximum return. So there's no point in having all these human beings. You're not able to exploit them. So you exploit those who are old, exploit those who are sick, you exploit those who want an education. No matter, to exploit them. You just create the mechanisms to do it. And the state is the overall provider of the mechanisms to exploit.
My final question I wanted to ask you, and of course this will be the first of many conversations exploring deeper the education system. The next time I have you on, I would love to talk about how Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model, how you can apply that to Ireland's state media as well as Ireland's corporate media. But the last question I'd like to ask you is about the future of the left in Ireland, and Ireland desperately needs a big, powerful left movement electorally, and and just in general. The body politic is, in Ireland, in New Zealand, is screaming for, leftism and a left project. But if I was in Ireland, I mean, I think I would be. Well, actually, no. Yeah, if I was in Ireland, no doubt I would be a member of the Communist Party of Ireland. But because of anti-communism, because of anti-communist leftism, and because of so much propaganda leveled against communist states, some of it true. I mean, there's a lot of half truths, but then that's often the problem. You have half truths which get weaponized to full on fake news. But it seems to me, I know for a fact, if you're campaigning in Ireland and saying to people, vote for the Communist Party of Ireland, people are already going to judge the book by its cover. So in the future, do you think the Communist Party of Ireland and all communist parties should abandon electoralism and just focus on movement building, consciousness raising, and lobbying the soft left to be more radical, transformative left in order to advance the policies which your party champions?
I think that's a big question. So I'll just keep it brief. You have to, as I say, the battle of ideas is key at this moment in time. Radical change is only brought about by the radicalization of the people, and therefore you should focus on the people, focus on those who are confused as to what the hell is going on, rather than focus on those who confuse them.
Mm-hmm.
So focus on the people who are confused. It's through struggle that people will learn. People learn both through struggle and through education, through theory. But primarily, most people engage themselves in forms of struggle. So therefore, how do you build struggle? Because struggle then brings them into the sharper point of contact, the sharper point of conflict with the existing order, with the existing socio-economic structures. So therefore, the way to do that, then once people are involved in struggle, then it's easier to engage with them about where we need to go. If people won't just follow an abstract idea. They won't follow an abstract idea. People will believe if the struggle that they're engaged in has an outcome which will benefit them materially. And I think that it's about people are motivated primarily by their own material interests. Therefore, how do we develop struggles which advance their material interests, which also at the same time challenge and weakens the power of capital? And I think that's where we need to be looking at, need to be focusing on. The whole world needs a more radical organizations, but that's neither here nor there. It's about the objective material conditions. And the objective material conditions is that capitalism is now moving into another deep crisis. It will have consequences. People who, whether it be a year, 6 months ago, you wouldn't have thought that that Google or Amazon or the banking industry would be letting go thousands of jobs, or the banks will be tottering on the brink, and the governments all over the world are scrambling around now to see, all telling us the banks are okay, the banks are okay, the banks, don't worry, the banks are okay. And then one day a bank goes, the next day another bank goes, the next day something else goes. These are the sorcerers. They've called forth these huge resources, these huge monsters, and they think they can control them. They can't. They're not controlled. They're not controllable. That the 30th largest bank in the world has collapsed. So they think, well, none of them saw it coming. He's the people in charge, and they said, "Oh, that was unexpected." But then, when the shit hits the fan, they said, "Well, we expected that. We caught Credit Suisse was a basket case," and you're thinking, "Well, you didn't say that last week. It was."
But
but
isn't it the final question though? So obviously, you and your comrades of the Communist Party of Ireland will continue to try to raise people's consciousness, campaign for left policies, and hopefully get more members to join the party and advance a truly radical socialist.
The most important thing is to push, is to at every opportunity to try to develop struggle, whether it be around housing, whether it be around health services, whether around ending partition and sort of for national sovereignty and national democracy and independence. It's about developing struggle. As I say, that when people are themselves come up against the limitations in their own expectations, because that's what capitalism does. Capitalism limits, says you cannot do this, you cannot do that, we cannot achieve this, we have to bring people to the point where they see that capitalism's limitations is that limits of capitalism are actual limits on human development, and on what could be a better society. So we have to constantly push that struggle, to push that situation forward, whereby people constantly come aware of their own the strictures placed upon them. As I say, the hidden hand of capital. We have to push and push and push, and that forms all forms of electoral struggles, but primarily it's about struggles within the working class to push the working class forward. And that's the difficult question, because where is the ideological struggle most intense?
I was just about to ask. The big final question is: isn't the problem our own problem, especially the Western left? Isn't our problem that we keep digging our own graves, that we keep engaging in anti-communist leftism? If we move beyond anti-communist leftism, if we stop judging the book by its cover, and if we when it comes to communist parties, don't you think that it's long overdue that the Western left and others abandon anti-communist leftism?
Well, it would be good.
Thoughts on that?
It would be good if they did abandon that, because communism is not anti-communism is not about isolating communists. It's about isolating the left. Until they begin to realize that it's about isolating the left, not about isolating just communists. So what they're doing is basically saying that all the socialist countries that emerged and social struggles that were there were complete failures. Therefore, communism is a complete failure. And therefore, if you're peddling any form of social transformation, you are peddling a failed ideology, a failed system. So that's why the cornerstone of that is that we have to, I think, where the ideological struggle is very intense is in with the working class movement. Because how do you get the bulk of society to acquiesce in their own exploitation? Because they believe that this system is common sense. It's the only way to do it. It's common sense. This is the way the system works. So therefore, we have a big task to say that no, it's not common sense. It's common sense only from those who control their own capital. But to the rest of humanity, to the environment, it is madness. It is absolutely madness to organize, because an economic activity is purely a simple thing. It's a market. What you produce, how you distribute, and how you sell it. And so it doesn't require capitalists to make things. It doesn't require capitalists to distribute things. It doesn't require capitalists to buy things. So basically, you're finding what is the most humane, environmentally sustainable way to provide human sustenance, whether in the form of housing, healthcare, the commodities that we need rather than the commodities we should have, but the commodities we need, and things like that. So I think these are all big questions. But I think the environment, I think, is going to bear down on all these questions one way or the other. I think they're not going to make their 1.5. I think basically in the next couple of decades, not for me anyway, but for generations after me, they're the ones who are going to have to face the consequences of monopoly capitalism, not actually doing anything about, because they can't do anything about the global environmental crisis, because it is a product of, because the environmental crisis is a product of the economic policies and strategies of global monopoly capital. So therefore, they're not going to cut off their own throats despite their face. So we have so there's a job of work to be done. Now is not the time for fatalism. Now is not the time for anti-communism or looking for somewhere there was pure socialism, because pure socialism itself will never exist. So long as monopoly capital is the dominant economic, political, and military force that it is, it's always going to, how you say, distort how socialism can emerge or will emerge. Because the first thing one has to do is the revolution has to defend itself. And that doesn't necessarily mean to the best forms of practice at times, the best practice at times. But that's what you do. That's what you have to do. So you don't, you can't go around and say, well, ideally we have to do this. And idealism doesn't get you anywhere. It might make you feel good, might make you feel a bit pure, that knows you've got the hands grubby and dirty by doing other things and by things which you don't necessarily want to do. But sometimes you feel that what other way forward is there going here? Because imperialism is a very predatory system. It is a system which will seek out any weakness and every weakness to exploit, and it will use every means to defeat its enemies, every single means to defeat its enemies. And therefore, if you're not an enemy of imperialism, then there's something wrong with you. You're not really leftist. It's not really leftist if you're not anti-imperialist, then you're not a leftist.
I completely agree with you. And then final question, which is Ireland, small country. If the revolution was to happen, tomorrow in Ireland, and Northern Ireland, gets remarried back into the Republic of Ireland, which Marxist-Leninist state do you think would be a great model for Ireland? Would it be Cuba? Would it be the once mighty Yugoslavia, or would it be I
think Cuba has a lot of things to offer. I think the revolutionary leadership have shown huge humanity, and I think any revolutionary without a deep sense of humanity is not really a revolutionary. So I think that the Cubans have shown huge humanity, the Cuban people and the Cuban revolutionary leadership, not just with the Cuban people and what they've struggled to achieve, and the very fact that they have achieved what they have achieved under huge pressure from external pressure, from blockades, everything else. They have managed to build a humane society like no other society in the world. They've managed to build a health service like no other society in the world. They managed to build a humane and egalitarian educational system beyond anything anybody else has achieved. So the Cuban Revolution, at the same time as that has had very scarce resources, it has been willing to and has shown itself willing to share those resources with others outside of its own borders. And its contribution to the liberation in Africa, its contribution to the liberation in Latin America is beyond questioning. So anybody who thinks themselves a lefty but anti-Cuban are basically they're a fool's dressed in clown's clothing, because they're actually nothing offering, or they're offering nothing to humanity. And I think the Cuban Revolution is something which all people could look to, because it is what is achieved in very difficult conditions. It is a beacon to humanity, a beacon of a different way forward, a beacon of a different socio-economic system is possible. And at this moment in time, is absolutely necessary if our planet is to survive. We cannot go on with the economic system that we have, because it's either capitalism or the complete destruction of the global environment.
And very briefly, Vietnamese, and very briefly, the Vietnamese or the Yugoslav model for Ireland?
Well, I don't think it's no. They've all of them are different. All of them are different. Vietnam survived the socialist construction, the socialist organization of the south of the north. It was that strength that defeated the power of U.S. defeated the French, and it defeated U.S. imperialism. So that was the socialist organization of the economy in North Vietnam, which basically created the capacity for it to defeat imperialism in the south and liberate Vietnam. So therefore, it's got a lot of things to offer. There's a lot of things to say. Yugoslavia, it had probably one of its most important victories or advances was it created a nation state, a state that a number of nations within it could identify with. And since the destruction of Yugoslavia, we've seen the ethnic bloodletting that took place and the interests of imperialism. So one of the big factors was that socialism. It shows that socialism can create national unity, can create unity among the people, can remove the historical antagonisms closely fostered by the ruling elites in past generations. So all of them bring to the table their own hard-won, concrete material experiences, and all of them lessons can be learned from each, that, and the other. So I think that from point of view of at this moment in time, that in the eye of the storm, in the belly of the beast, is Cuba is very much central to that, because U.S. imperialism knows if it can defeat the Cuban Revolution, then they will then basically sweep across Latin America, and they hope then to bury the aspirations that the Cubans hold out to millions and millions of people in Latin America. They can defeat that and crush those aspirations. So it's critical that the Cuban Revolution is promoted, sustained, and supported actively, and not any sort of half-baked critical support, and they support this and they don't support that. We can't afford an a la carte. We're not a la carte. We either the first how do you say point is that we are partisan. We are partisan. We stand on the line of democracy and anti-imperialism against anti-democratic forces and imperialism. So that's the bottom line: is where do you stand on the line of imperialism? Are you for it or against it? And those who equivocate end up usually, when you stand in the middle of the road, you usually get run down. So the important thing is we're not standing in the middle of the road. We're standing with those oppressed, with those fighting imperialism. And so, good evening to your listeners, and thank you very much.
Well, we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Eugene McCarten. He may not be the General Secretary anymore, but he still is an active senior member of the Communist Party of Ireland. Eugene, thank you so much for taking the time of the day. And again, tell any member of your party, it could be a woman, it could be non-binary, it could be any member of the party, if they ever want to come on to talk about Irish politics, including the ones in Northern Ireland. Open invitation, and thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you. Take care.